The whole boardroom went quiet the moment Hargrove turned away, not the polite quiet of professionals waiting for a meeting to begin. The sharp, airless kind, the kind that follows something that cannot be taken back. Lawrence Whitfield had extended his hand, a simple gesture, the kind exchanged 1,000 times a day in rooms like this one, glass and steel, 42 floors above the street, the kind of room designed to make a man feel either very important or very small. He had extended his hand, and Diane Sorrell, Chief Executive Officer of Sorrell Capital Group, had looked at it the way a person looks at something left on a chair they are about to sit in. She turned to her assistant. "Where's the presentation?" Lawrence Whitfield did not lower his hand immediately. That small detail, the hand still out for one breath, then two, was something 3 people in that room would remember for the rest of their careers. Then he lowered it. He did not look embarrassed. He did not look angry. He looked, if anything, like a man who had just confirmed something he had already suspected. He pulled the chair nearest him, the one at the far end of the table, rather than the seat that had been arranged for him near the center, and sat down. He set his bag on the floor, an old bag, dark brown leather, the kind with brass clasps that needed 2 thumbs to open. One of the clasps had been repaired with a strip of electrical tape. A junior associate named Preston, sitting along the wall with a laptop he would never open, noticed the tape and leaned slightly toward the colleague beside him. Diane Sorrell had not built her company by being careless. That was what people always said about her, and she believed it to be true. 15 years ago, she had taken a regional lending firm with 11 employees and no particular vision, and transformed it into one of the most aggressively profitable investment groups on the Eastern Seaboard. She had been featured in 4 magazine profiles. She kept one of them, framed in her private office, not the one clients saw, the real one, behind the other door. She was 51 years old, had been divorced once, had 2 daughters she spoke to on alternating Sundays, and had not taken a vacation of more than 4 days since 2019. She was, in her own estimation, and in the estimation of most people who dealt with her, formidable. She had not, however, done her homework on Lawrence Whitfield. This was not carelessness, or rather, it was a specific kind of carelessness, the kind that grows in people who have been right so often for so long that the machinery of doubt begins to rust. Her head of acquisitions, a careful man named Elliot, had flagged the meeting 3 weeks prior and sent a summary brief to her assistant. The brief had been printed, placed in a manila folder, and set on a corner of Diane's desk where it had been buried under a prospectus she was more interested in. Elliot had followed up once. Her assistant had mentioned it at the end of a Thursday call when Diane was already pulling on her coat. She had said, "I'll read it tonight." She had not read it that night. What she knew, the name of the entity, Whitfield Holdings, which sounded modest, almost deliberately so. What she assumed, a regional investor, mid-level assets, the kind of meeting her acquisitions team occasionally arranged to keep their pipeline visible. The man's name had registered as the kind of name she could forget immediately, and retrieve later if necessary. She had not retrieved it. Lawrence Whitfield sat at the far end of the table and waited. He had a particular quality of stillness that was not quite patience. It was older than patience, less effortful. The kind of stillness that comes not from discipline but from having sat in enough rooms, waited through enough silences, to understand that most of what happens in them is theater, and theater, no matter how well performed, eventually ends. He was 63 years old, though most people, looking at him, would have guessed older or younger depending on which part of him they studied. His hands were the hands of a man who had done physical work in some earlier chapter of his life, wide across the knuckles, slightly rough at the edges, though clean and still. His face was the face of someone who had decided at some point to stop performing for other people. He wore a gray suit that had been good once and remained presentable without being remarkable. His tie was navy blue and slightly too wide, the fashion of a decade ago. He had driven himself to the meeting in a 12-year-old Volvo that he kept because it ran well, and he had no particular interest in what other people thought about what he drove. He had been a widower for 6 years. His wife Beverly had died in the spring of a year that had otherwise been very good to him financially, which had seemed to him at the time, and still seemed to him now, a kind of cosmic joke without a punchline. He had a son, Daniel, who was 28 and worked in environmental law in Portland, and called every Sunday without fail. Lawrence Whitfield was not a man who talked about his son to people he had just met, but Daniel was, in the quiet accounting of his life, the thing he was most proud of. Diane Sorrell finished her exchange with her assistant and turned back to the table. "Mr." She glanced at the name card her assistant had set in front of her seat. A small hesitation. "Whitfield, thank you for coming up. My team tells me you're interested in discussing a potential partnership." The word partnership landed with a faint condescension she did not intend to hide entirely. Partnership was the polite word used with entities too small for acquisition and too present to ignore. "That's one way to put it," Lawrence Whitfield said. His voice was unhurried. Not slow, unhurried. "There is a difference." Diane waited for him to continue. He did not continue immediately. Around the table, 6 members of her executive team shifted in the various ways people shift when they are watching something they cannot yet categorize. Elliot, the head of acquisitions, was watching Whitfield carefully. Elliot had read the brief. "We had a specific opportunity in mind," Lawrence Whitfield said. "I can outline it if you'd like, or I can leave the materials and give your people time to look through them." He glanced at the bag with the electrical taped clasp. "Either way, why don't you give us the overview?" Diane said. She uncapped her pen. She was already, very slightly, not paying full attention. There was a call she needed to return before 3 o'clock, and the presentation from the Singapore group was waiting on her desktop, and this meeting she had not adequately prepared for, was occupying a slot she would have preferred to use differently. Lawrence Whitfield nodded once. He reached down, opened the bag, both clasps, the repaired one first, and removed a single folder, not a presentation deck, not a tablet, a folder, the kind with a plain blue cover, the kind that cost 40 cents at an office supply store. He set it on the table without opening it and looked at Diane Sorrell. 18 months ago, he said, your company lost the Harmon portfolio to a liquidity problem. I know that because I was the one who provided the liquidity to the group that outbid you. Since then, you've had 2 near misses on acquisitions that would have meaningfully changed your position in the mid-market lending space. I watched both of them." He paused. "I'm not here to discuss a partnership in the way your team may have presented it. I'm here because I'm prepared to commit $320 million to a restructuring vehicle with Sorrell as the operating arm, structured so that you retain operational control, and I take a silent position." The room did not go quiet again. The room had never entirely recovered from the first quiet. But something shifted, a collective recalibration, the subtle internal sensation of people who had been watching a minor key situation suddenly finding themselves in a different key entirely. Diane Sorrell's pen was still uncapped. She had not written anything. Elliot, along the side of the table, closed the laptop he had opened mostly as a prop. $320 million. Silent position. Those 2 phrases in sequence had a weight that rearranged the architecture of the conversation. Diane Sorrell was, whatever else might be said about her, quick. She had built an empire on quickness, on the ability to read a room, reverse course, reframe a situation in real time. She felt that quickness now, the gears engaging. She smiled. The smile was practiced but not insincere. It was the smile of a person who genuinely understood that the situation had changed and was attempting, efficiently, to change with it. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I want to apologize. When you arrived, I wasn't at my best. The morning has been." "You don't need to apologize," Lawrence Whitfield said. His voice had the same quality it had held throughout. Not warm, not cold. Level. "I'm not here about the handshake." The word handshake dropped into the room like a stone into water. He had named it. No one else had been willing to name it. Diane held his gaze. "I'd like to hear more about the structure you're proposing." "I'm sure you would," he said. He opened the folder. What followed was 40 minutes of the most efficient, precise financial conversation that 3 members of that team, veterans of hundreds of such meetings, would later say they had ever witnessed. Lawrence Whitfield did not use slides. He spoke from memory, occasionally turning a page in the folder to reference a figure, but mostly simply talking. He knew Sorrell Capital's balance sheet more intimately than 2 of the executives sitting around that table knew it. He named specific positions. He described specific inefficiencies. He outlined a restructuring that was not punitive, that was, in fact, generous, but that was structured in a way that made clear he was doing the offering and they were doing the considering. He answered questions without preamble. When someone asked something he found imprecise, he said so, briefly, and waited for the question to be rephrased. He was not unkind about it. He was simply exact. At the end of the 40 minutes, he closed the folder and set his hands flat on the table. "I'd like a decision by Thursday," he said. "Not a final decision. An indication of direction. If the direction is no, that's fine. I have other uses for the capital." "That's a short window," said the man to Diane's right, Robert, her CFO. "I understand that," Lawrence Whitfield said. "That's why I named it." He stood. He picked up the folder and put it back in the bag, which he then closed, the repaired clasp catching on the second try. "I'll leave my contact with Elliot," he said. "He has it." He looked at Elliot when he said this, not at Diane. Elliot nodded. Lawrence Whitfield walked the length of the table. He did not rush. He walked the way he had sat, without performance, without demonstration, in the way of a man who had no particular need for other people's attention. At the door he paused, not dramatically, simply because the door required a moment to open. He did not look back. Diane Sorrell sat at the head of her table and watched the door close. Around her, 5 people were looking at her with the particular expression of colleagues who are waiting to see which direction the weather is going before deciding how to dress. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Elliot, when did the brief come in on this one?" Elliot's answer was careful. 3 weeks ago. She nodded slowly. She uncapped her pen again, then capped it again. She was thinking about the handshake, not sentimentally, not with guilt exactly, but with the analytic portion of her mind that had built her career on reading situations accurately. She had misread this one, not at the margins, at the foundation. "Set up the Thursday call," she said. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. The meeting ended. The room emptied in the gradual way rooms empty after something significant has happened. People leaving not quite in groups, not quite alone. The conversation already beginning in the hallways in voices lower than usual. Preston, the junior associate with the laptop, was the last one out. He paused at the doorway and looked back at the chair at the far end of the table where Lawrence Whitfield had sat. The chair was slightly pulled away from the table at an angle. The angle of someone who had left without pushing it back in, not from rudeness, but simply from not thinking about it, from having moved on completely the moment he stood up. Preston thought about the electrical tape on the clasp. He thought about the way the man had spoken, not with the energy of someone trying to impress, but with the energy of someone reporting something he already knew to be true. He filed that away. He was 24 years old, and there were things being demonstrated to him that day that no program had taught him. Outside on the street, Lawrence Whitfield sat in his Volvo for a moment before starting the engine. He was not reviewing the meeting. He had already reviewed the meeting, internally, efficiently, in the way he processed most things, quickly and without drama. He was thinking about Daniel, who had called that morning at 7:15, because he had found a good bakery near his apartment in Portland and had wanted to describe the particular quality of their cardamom rolls in some detail. Lawrence had listened to the whole description. It had taken 11 minutes and he had been happy to give them. He started the engine. The Volvo turned over on the first try, as it always did. He had other meetings that week. One in Boston, one over the phone with a group out of Austin. Neither was as large as what he had just laid on the table at Sorrell Capital, but neither was inconsequential. He was a man who did not think in terms of single bets. On Thursday morning, at 9:17, Elliot called. The call lasted 4 minutes. Lawrence Whitfield asked 2 questions and confirmed 2 figures. He did not ask about Diane Sorrell's posture on the deal, because he did not need to. The fact of the call, at the time of the call, answered that question already. "We'd like to move forward," Elliot said. "Good," Lawrence Whitfield said. The deal was formalized over the following 6 weeks. It was structured precisely as Lawrence Whitfield had outlined it in the room. $320 million, silent position, Sorrell as operating arm. The announcement was made through a brief press release on a Tuesday. The kind of press release deliberately written to say everything necessary and nothing additional. In the financial community, the response was immediate and pointed. Within 48 hours, 3 separate analysts revised their outlook on Sorrell Capital. The stock movement was visible. The phone in Diane Sorrell's office, the line reserved for people who mattered, rang more in the 72 hours following the announcement than it had in the preceding month. She took most of the calls. She was professional, engaged, appropriately measured about the future. She said the right things. She had always been good at saying the right things. But in the quiet moments, the commute, the early morning before her assistant arrived, the 30 seconds in the elevator between floors, she returned, without wanting to the image of Lawrence Whitfield's hand, extended, waiting, and her own response, which had come from nowhere, or rather from somewhere she did not entirely like to examine. From an assumption so fast and automatic that it had bypassed judgment entirely. She had looked at the bag with the electrical tape and the suit from another decade and had made a calculation. The calculation had been wrong in the largest possible way. Not because of the money. Money was, in the end, a legible thing, a thing with numbers attached. The calculation had been wrong in the way that mattered more than money, the way that revealed something about the internal machinery of a person when they are not being careful. She was, professionally, in a better position than she had been before Lawrence Whitfield walked into her boardroom. The numbers made that clear. The market made that clear. She was also, in some quieter register, changed by the experience, not dramatically, not in the way of conversion or revelation, but in the way of a person who has seen very plainly the gap between who they believe themselves to be and who they actually were in a given moment. That gap was not something she could close with a press release or a restructured balance sheet. Lawrence Whitfield did not follow Sorrel Capital's subsequent press coverage. He was aware of it. His people kept him informed as a matter of routine, but he did not seek it out. He had not made the investment because he needed it to succeed as a story. He had made it because the underlying structure was sound, and because Elliot, who was a careful man, had made a clear case for it over several months of quiet observation. He did not think very often about the handshake. He had been in rooms over the course of his career where similar things had happened, sometimes more overtly, sometimes less. He had developed, not as a philosophy but simply as a practice, the habit of measuring people by the conversation that followed rather than the opening gesture. A gesture could be reflex. A conversation was a choice. Diane Sorrell's conversation, once it had begun in earnest, had been good. Precise, responsive, honest about the gaps in her knowledge. He respected that. He had made the deal in part on the strength of that 40 minutes, and the strength of 40 minutes was, in his experience, a reasonable indicator of how the longer work would go. On a Sunday in early October, he drove up to see Daniel in Portland. They went to the bakery Daniel had described, a small place on a side street with 6 tables and a chalkboard menu, and a woman behind the counter who knew Daniel by name and asked about his current case without being asked. Lawrence had the cardamom roll. Daniel had been right about it. It was very good. They walked afterward along the waterfront in the particular way that fathers and adult sons sometimes walk, not talking constantly, not needing to. Comfortable in the silences. Lawrence told Daniel about the Sorrell deal in approximately 3 sentences. Daniel asked 2 practical questions and then said he was glad it had worked out, and then asked if Lawrence had heard from his Aunt Brenda recently, and the conversation moved, naturally, elsewhere. The money existed. The deal existed. The structures and agreements and signed documents existed in offices and databases, and the professional memories of accountants and lawyers. None of that was the thing Lawrence Whitfield carried with him on the walk. The thing he carried was the bakery, and the waterfront, and the way Daniel had laughed at something. A pelican, landing clumsily on a piling with entirely too much confidence, and the way the afternoon light came in low off the water, and the ease of it. The ease of being known by someone, simply and without condition, in the way that only a few relationships in a long life ever allow. He had built many things. He was still building things. He would probably continue building things until he could not. But this, the walk, the light, the laughter at the pelican, this he could not build. This could only be tended. He had learned in the long way that most real things are learned, that knowing the difference was most of the work.